Here's the beginning of your story. Hashtag the unthinkable betrayal. The heartbreaking case of Jennifer Dulos ***. The cold morning air bit at Jennifer's skin as she stepped outside. The suburban streets of New Canaan were eerily quiet. A thin mist curled around the trees, swallowing the distant houses in a ghostly haze. Jennifer tightened her coat, her breath forming fragile clouds in the air. Something felt off. A nagging unease coiled in her stomach, though she couldn't explain why. She checked her phone, no new messages. Her soon-to-be ex-husband, Fotis, had been strangely silent. Too silent. Jennifer inhaled sharply, shaking off the thought. She had errands to run, 5 kids to care for, a new life to build. The past was behind her, or so she thought. She climbed into her black Chevy Suburban, the leather seats cold beneath her. As she turned the key, the engine rumbled to life, but another sound made her pause. A faint rustling. From the back seat. Her heart stuttered. Slowly, she turned her head. Nothing. Just the shadows shifting as sunlight leaked through the tinted windows. Jennifer exhaled, forcing a smile. Paranoia. Divorce did that to a person. She pulled out of the driveway, trying to shake the unease. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. As she drove, the houses blurred past, familiar yet distant. The world outside felt unreal, like a stage set for a play she wasn't ready for. Then, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Too late to run now. A shiver crawled up Jennifer's spine. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Before she could react, the traffic light ahead flickered from green to yellow. Red. She slowed to a stop. The car behind her didn't. A sickening crunch echoed through the morning air. Jennifer lurched forward, her seatbelt locking against her chest. Her phone tumbled to the floor. Dazed, she blinked, trying to process. The car behind her, a dark SUV, remained still, its driver hidden behind black-tinted windows. No one stepped out. Jennifer's breath hitched. A pulse of terror surged through her veins. She reached for her phone, but then, the driver's side door of the SUV opened. A man stepped out. Tall, dressed in black, face obscured by a baseball cap. Jennifer's heart pounded against her ribs. She fumbled for the door handle. Locked. The man walked toward her, slow, deliberate. A gloved hand reached for something in his jacket. Jennifer's world narrowed to a single, terrifying thought. Here's the continuation of your story. Jennifer's pulse roared in her ears. Her hands trembled as she jammed her thumb against the door lock. Nothing. The man was closer now, his steps slow, measured. She could see the fine leather of his gloves, the way his breath fogged the air. He wasn't in a hurry. That terrified her more than anything. Jennifer's mind raced. Options. Think. The parking brake. No time. Reverse, too risky. Honking? Would anyone even care? The man reached the driver's side window. She saw it then, a glint of silver in his hand. A knife. Her breath caught in her throat. No more thinking. She acted. Jennifer slammed the gear shift into reverse and floored the gas. Tires screeched against asphalt. The SUV behind her crunched as she rammed into it. The man staggered back, his hands slamming against the glass. She saw his face now, just for a second. Dark eyes, void of anything human. Jennifer didn't wait. She jerked the gear into drive, slammed her foot down. Her car lurched forward, narrowly missing the man as she veered onto the road. The SUV behind her? It roared to life. Her rearview mirror filled with headlights. A chase. Jennifer's hands were slick on the steering wheel. The streets blurred past as she weaved through traffic. She couldn't go home. She couldn't go to the police. Not yet. She needed to know. Who was following her? Why now? Then, another text. Her phone lit up on the passenger seat. Her stomach twisted as she glanced down. Stop running, Jen. It only makes this harder. A cold dread coiled in her gut. They knew her. They knew her. The SUV behind her gained speed. Jennifer's foot pressed harder on the gas. But up ahead, a red light. An intersection. Cars. No way through. No time to stop. She had seconds. One choice. crash, or be caught. Jennifer sucked in a breath and made her decision. Here's the continuation of your story. Jennifer yanked the wheel hard to the right. Her tires screamed as her SUV lurched into an empty side street. A narrow escape. The SUV behind her hesitated, just for a second. Then it followed. Jennifer's heart slammed against her ribs. She wasn't losing them. Not like this. She sped down the narrow street, weaving between parked cars. Ahead, a sharp turn. Too sharp. Too fast. Jennifer gritted her teeth and took it anyway. Her SUV tilted, nearly skidding. For a breathless moment, she thought she'd lose control. But she didn't. She straightened the wheel, her hands shaking. The SUV behind her? Not as lucky. A sickening crunch. A loud scrape of metal. Jennifer glanced in the mirror. The other car had slammed into a lamppost. Smoke curled from the hood. Jennifer gasped, her pulse a frantic drumbeat. She had seconds, maybe less. Her hands fumbled for her phone. She needed to call someone. Anyone. The police? Would they believe her? Would they act in time? She didn't know, but she had to try. She tapped the screen. Her fingers trembled as she dialed. Then, a voice behind her. Close. Too close. Going somewhere, Jen? Her blood turned to ice. She whipped around. A shadow moved outside her window. The driver of the SUV. He wasn't hurt. He wasn't even limping. Jennifer's breath hitched. He raised his hand. The knife gleamed under the dim streetlight. She lunged for the gear shift. Too late. The door handle rattled. Locked. But for how long? Jennifer's mind screamed. Think. Move. Survive. She shoved her foot against the gas pedal. The tires screeched. Her SUV lunged forward. For a split second, she saw the man's face. No fear. No anger. Just cold calculation. Then, a thud. A sharp jolt. She hit something. Or someone. Her heart seized. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She sped down the street, her breath ragged. Lights blurred past. Her phone slipped from her fingers. She didn't care. She needed to get away. From him. From all of it. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. Here's the continuation of your story. Jennifer's fingers tightened around the wheel. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she could still feel his presence, like a shadow clinging to her skin. She glanced at the rearview mirror. The wrecked SUV was shrinking in the distance. But that didn't mean she was safe. Not yet. She needed somewhere to go. Somewhere no one would expect. The thought hit her like a jolt of electricity. The house. Her old house. The one she had fled from months ago. The one where everything had fallen apart. Jennifer hesitated. Going back, there was like walking into a nightmare. But where else could she go? Her friends, too risky. A hotel, too obvious. She had to disappear. Just for a while. Just until she could think. She turned onto a familiar road. The trees thick and dark, swallowing the street in eerie silence. The house loomed ahead, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. Empty. Abandoned. It should have felt like a safe haven. But as Jennifer pulled into the driveway, a chill slithered down her spine. Something felt wrong. Off. She killed the engine, listening. The wind whispered through the trees. Leaves rustled against the pavement. Nothing else. She reached for the door handle, pausing. Her instincts screamed at her. Leave. Run. But there was nowhere else to go. She stepped out, her breath loud in the silence. The house stood before her, dark and lifeless. The front door unlocked. Her stomach twisted. She knew she had locked it the last time she was here. Jennifer swallowed hard. Maybe it was the realtor. Maybe they had been showing the house. Maybe. She pushed the door open. Darkness swallowed her. She reached for the light switch. Flicked it on. Nothing. The power was out. Jennifer hesitated, her pulse quickening. Then, a sound. Soft. Barely there. A floorboard creaking upstairs. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone was here. Waiting. Watching. Jennifer's blood ran cold. She wasn't alone. Here's the continuation of your story. Jennifer's breath hitched. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone. No signal. Of course. The house was in a dead zone. She had always hated that. A faint breeze whispered through the hallway, carrying the scent of dust and something else. Something metallic. Her stomach twisted. Blood? She swallowed hard. No. It had to be her imagination. Another creak. This time closer. Jennifer's body went rigid. Someone was upstairs, and they weren't trying to hide anymore. She could hear slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the wooden floor. Step. Pause. Step. Like they were waiting for her to react. Run or stay. Fight or hide. Jennifer's pulse pounded in her ears. She had to move. Now. She slipped off her heels, careful not to make a sound. Backing toward the kitchen, she scanned the darkness for anything she could use as a weapon. A knife. A pan. Something. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of a fire poker near the fireplace. She gripped it tightly. A shadow passed at the top of the stairs. Jennifer's breath caught. Her grip on the poker tightened. She should run. She wanted to run, but something in her refused to turn her back. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Jennifer, you should have stayed away. Her blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. Knew it better than anyone. Her body refused to move, because standing at the top of the stairs, barely visible in the dim light, was Fotis. Her husband. Her ex-husband. Jennifer's mind reeled. It wasn't possible. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to know where she was. But he did, and the look in his eyes. Cold. Empty. Hungry. He took a slow step down. Then another. Jennifer's grip on the poker tightened until her knuckles turned white. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. What she would say. What she would do. But now, she could only think one thing. She was never supposed to leave him alive. Here's the continuation of your story. Fotis descended the stairs, his movements unnervingly calm. Jennifer's muscles locked, her instincts screaming to flee, but her feet remained rooted. The fire poker felt impossibly heavy in her hands. "Why are you here, Fotis?" she managed, her voice trembling. He stopped halfway down, tilting his head like a predator, sizing up its prey. "Why am I here?" he echoed, his tone laced with mockery. "You've been running, Jennifer. Leaving things unfinished. That's messy." His calmness was worse than anger, worse than shouting. It was calculated. Jennifer swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. "There's nothing left to finish," she said, her voice firmer this time. Fotis chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. "Oh, Jennifer," he said, stepping down another stair. "There's always something left." He reached into his coat. Her chest tightened. The glint of metal caught her eye. A blade. Not just any blade. A hunting knife. Long and cruel. Jennifer's grip on the fire poker tightened. Her knuckles ached, but she refused to loosen her hold. She took a step back, her heels hitting the edge of the kitchen tiles. The sharp chill of the floor beneath her feet grounded her for a fleeting second. "I'm not afraid of you," she lied, her voice trembling. Fotis smirked, his eyes narrowing. "Liar," he whispered, taking another step. Jennifer's heart slammed against her ribs. Her gaze darted to the front door. Too far. The back door? Locked. Her only option was through him. Fotis lunged. Jennifer swung the poker with every ounce of strength she had. It connected with a sickening thud, the force vibrating through her arms. Fotis stumbled, a grunt escaping his lips. But he didn't fall. Instead, he steadied himself, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Is that all you've got?" he taunted, blood trickling from his temple. Jennifer's stomach churned. This wasn't the man she married. This was something else entirely. He moved again, faster this time. Jennifer swung again, but Fotis grabbed the poker mid-swing, wrenching it from her hands. The metal clattered to the floor. Panic surged through her veins as he loomed over her, the knife glinting in his hand. She scrambled backward, her palms sliding against the cold tile. Fotis crouched, his face inches from hers. "You should have stayed quiet," he hissed, raising the knife. Jennifer's hand groped blindly behind her, searching. Anything. Her fingers brushed against something heavy and cold. The cast-iron skillet. Without thinking, she swung it upward with all her might. The impact was brutal, the sound echoing through the house. Fotis collapsed, the knife clattering to the floor beside him. Jennifer gasped for air, her chest heaving. Blood pooled beneath his head, dark and sticky. But she didn't dare look away. Her body shook violently, adrenaline coursing through her. She reached for the knife, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. Was he dead? Or just unconscious? Her mind raced, but one thought rose above the chaos. If he wasn't dead, he would come for her again. And next time, she might not survive. Here's the continuation of your story. Jennifer's breath came in ragged gasps. The knife felt heavy in her trembling hands. Fotis lay sprawled on the floor, blood seeping into the cracks of the tile. But she knew him, knew what he was capable of. She had thought she was free before, and she had been wrong. Her pulse pounded as she inched closer. Was he breathing? She crouched, the knife still gripped tightly. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood. Fotis didn't move, didn't even twitch. Jennifer's shaking fingers reached toward his neck. She needed to be sure. Her fingertips brushed his skin. A hand shot up. Jennifer barely had time to react before Fotis' fingers clamped around her wrist, crushingly strong. She yelped, trying to pull away, but he wrenched her forward. His eyes, dark, feral, snapped open. You always were weak, Jennifer. He rasped, blood dripping from his temple. Panic exploded inside her. She thrashed, trying to break free, but his grip was iron. Fotis twisted, shoving her onto her back, his weight pressing down. Jennifer gasped as the air rushed from her lungs. His hand wrapped around her throat. Tight. Too tight. Dark spots danced in her vision. Her free hand flailed, searching. The knife. Where was the knife? Fotis' grip tightened. Her body screamed for air. Jennifer's fingers brushed against something cold. Metal. The knife. With the last of her strength, she swung. The blade sank deep into Fotis' side. A sharp, wet gasp escaped his lips. His body jerked. His grip loosened. Jennifer twisted the knife deeper. Fotis let out a strangled noise, his eyes wide with shock. Then, he slumped. His body collapsed against her, dead weight. Jennifer gasped, shoving him off, sucking in desperate lungfuls of air. Her vision swam. Her hands, slick with blood, shook violently. She stared at Fotis' lifeless form. This time, he wasn't getting back up. A sob tore from her throat. Relief. Terror. Disbelief. She had survived. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The police. She had to call the police. Jennifer staggered to her feet, gripping the counter for support. Her phone, where was it? She scanned the kitchen, her vision still hazy. Then, a sound. Not from Fotis. From outside. The crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights flooded through the windows. Someone else was here. Jennifer's blood ran cold. Had he come alone? Or was this just the beginning? Here's the continuation of your story. Jennifer's breath hitched. The headlights carved long shadows across the walls. A second car. A second person. Her mind screamed. Run. Hide. Do something. But her body felt frozen. She gripped the bloody knife tighter, her knuckles white. The car door creaked open. Heavy boots crunched against the gravel. Then, a voice. Low. Measured. Fotis? Jennifer's stomach twisted. A second person. Someone else was supposed to be here. She backed up slowly, her bare feet slipping on the tile. If they saw her, if they saw what she had done, a new wave of terror surged through her. A shadow moved past the front window. They were coming closer. Jennifer's pulse thundered in her ears. She had to make a choice. Stay and face them, or run while she still could. Her eyes darted to the back door. Locked. The living room window. Too high. Then, a sound. The front doorknob rattled. Jennifer sucked in a sharp breath. She tightened her grip on the knife. The door creaked open. A figure stepped inside. Tall. Broad-shouldered. A man in a dark coat. His gaze swept the room. His eyes landed on Fotis' body. He went still. Jennifer held her breath. Then, slowly, the man exhaled. Not in shock. Not in horror. But in quiet understanding. Like he had expected this. Like he had planned for this. He looked up. His eyes met Jennifer's. Cold. Calculating. And then, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Jennifer's blood turned to ice. He took a step forward, then another. "I guess you saved me the trouble," he murmured. Jennifer's throat went dry. Her fingers curled tighter around the knife. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man tilted his head, amused. "Oh, Jennifer," he said softly. "You really don't know?" Something shifted in his expression. Something dark. Jennifer's stomach dropped. Before she could react, he reached into his coat. A glint of silver. Another knife. Jennifer's breath hitched. She wasn't safe. Not yet. Not at all. She took a step back. The man took a step forward. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. Here's the continuation of your story. Jennifer's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. The man's cold smile only widened as he stepped closer, the knife glinting in his hand. She could hear her pulse in her ears, louder than anything else. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The window? Too far. The back door? Too slow. Then she saw it. The front door, slightly ajar. The only way out. She moved before her brain could even process it. Her feet barely touched the ground as she bolted toward the door. But the man was faster. He reached out, his fingers brushing her shoulder. She stumbled, her breath caught in her throat. Jennifer swung around, knife raised, desperation fueling her movements. But he was already backing away, smiling. "Not today," he said softly. With a swift movement, he flicked the blade, cutting through the air. The tip of the knife sliced across her arm. Pain shot through her like electricity. Jennifer gasped, stumbling back, clutching her bleeding arm. Her eyes locked on the man's face, the same chilling smile never fading. He wasn't here to kill her. Not yet. "You've made this so much more interesting," he said, his voice like honey laced with poison. Jennifer's head spun. She couldn't afford to get distracted. She needed to get out. Her feet were moving before her mind could even process the pain. She sprinted toward the door, ignoring the blood that dripped from her arm. She burst out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. But as soon as she was outside, the door slammed shut behind her. Jennifer froze. The sound echoed in the night. A flash of headlights from the driveway. A second car. It wasn't over. They were still coming. Her heart raced as she spun around, scanning the empty street. No one in sight. No one, except the two cars parked on either side of the street. Her mind screamed for her to keep running. She couldn't stop. Not now. But then, a voice. Sharp. Jennifer. It wasn't the man from inside. It was a different voice. A voice she recognized too well. Fotis. Her heart stuttered. Impossible. He had to be. But there he stood, at the end of the street, his face shadowed in the dim light. His voice carried across the distance. "You didn't think you could run forever, did you?" Her breath caught. Jennifer spun on her heels, but the world around her spun too. She couldn't escape. She couldn't hide. Everything was closing in. Here's the continuation of your story. Jennifer's legs shook beneath her, her mind racing in a blur of panic and confusion. Fotis stood still at the end of the street, his face a mask of cold resolve. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt numb. Impossible. How was he alive? Hadn't she just? She could barely form the thoughts. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled back a few steps. But Fotis didn't move. He just watched her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I told you, Jennifer," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "You can't outrun me." Jennifer's mind spun wildly. Was this a trick? Was it a hallucination from the shock? She couldn't tell. She wanted to ask him, asterisk how? Asterisk. Why? But the words stuck in her throat. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Fotis took a single step forward. His presence felt like a vice closing in on her. Every step he took made her feel smaller, weaker. "Where are you going to run now?" he asked, his lips curling into a twisted smile. Jennifer's breath hitched. She couldn't think. She had to move. She had to. Suddenly, the headlights of the second car flared to life. The engine roared to life, and the car screeched forward. A familiar figure emerged from the car. The man. The one with the cold smile. He was here too. Her pulse raced even faster as he approached. Two of them now. Fotis and this stranger. Her mind screamed at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. Her blood-slicked fingers still clutched the knife, but her body felt like stone. Jennifer. The man's voice was almost affectionate, as if he were a friend greeting her. I really thought you'd make this more interesting. She couldn't breathe. The world around her felt like it was closing in. She needed to get away. But how? Fotis' footsteps echoed in the silence, his eyes locked on hers. We've been planning this for a long time, Jennifer, he said, as though they were discussing the weather. Her heart pounded in her chest. He wasn't alone. None of this was an accident. Her mind scrambled for any possible way out. And then, a flash of memory. Her car. The one parked by the street corner. She hadn't locked it. Could she reach it? The panic clawed at her chest. One wrong move, and they'd have her. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. She didn't wait for her mind to catch up with her body. In a burst of adrenaline, Jennifer turned and bolted down the street. Her legs screamed at her, but she pushed forward, ignoring the burning in her muscles. She heard footsteps behind her. Faster. Closer. Her car wasn't far now. She could do this. She had to. Jennifer reached the driver's side door, her hand fumbling for the handle. It was open. She slammed the door shut behind her, her breath ragged. The engine roared to life. The car lurched forward. She wasn't looking back. Not this time. But just as she turned the wheel, a shadow crossed in front of her headlights. Someone. The man. He was standing in the middle of the street, unmoving. Jennifer slammed on the brakes, her heart in her throat. She came to a screeching halt inches from him. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, unblinking. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Slowly, he turned his head to look at her, his eyes locked on hers. I told you, Jennifer, he said with that same soft, mocking voice. You can't outrun the past. Jennifer's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Her car was still in drive, but she couldn't move. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run, and the nightmare was just beginning. Here's the continuation of the final part of your story. Jennifer's thoughts whirled in a chaotic storm. The man's words echoed in her mind, but they made no sense. How had she been part of this? How could she have been trapped in a game she didn't even know existed? Her pulse hammered in her temples as she tried to make sense of it all. But the world around her grew quieter, as if the very air had been sucked from the space between them. She took a step back, but the man was already too close, his presence suffocating. His eyes, dark, knowing, were fixed on her, as though he could see everything she had ever tried to hide. Jennifer's throat tightened. I don't understand. What do you want from me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The man smiled again, that same twisted, cold grin. I told you, Jennifer. It's not what I want. It's what you've always wanted, what you've always been running from. Her breath caught in her chest as a sudden realization dawned upon her. A memory, long buried, resurfaced like a dark wave crashing into her consciousness. The strange faces, the whispers, the overwhelming sense of something wrong, something hidden beneath the surface of her life. All of it came rushing back in one overwhelming, crushing moment. This wasn't just a nightmare. It was a carefully woven web. She had been caught in it from the very beginning. Her vision blurred. Jennifer's hand reached for the knife at her side, but she stopped herself. No, this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about facing the truth. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've always been a part of the plan, Jennifer. Whether you realized it or not, you've been walking toward this moment your entire life. It was never about escaping. It was about accepting. Jennifer stood still, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. The reality was crashing in around her, and for the first time, she understood. There was no escaping the past, no running from the choices she had made. And in the end, there was nothing left but to face the consequences. The darkness that had haunted her all these years, the betrayal, the lies, the broken pieces of her past. It all came flooding to the surface, and she could no longer turn away from it. She looked into the man's eyes one last time, knowing there was no more fight left in her. And for the first time, she felt a strange peace settle over her. The game was over. She had lost. Here's the continuation of your story. The peace that had settled over Jennifer felt unsettling, as if she were drifting in an endless void, unable to escape or find anything solid to cling to. The weight of the moment bore down on her, suffocating her with its finality. The man's gaze never wavered, and in the silence, it felt as though the world around them had stopped. There were no sounds, no rustling of trees in the wind, no distant hum of traffic. Just the steady rhythm of Jennifer's heartbeat, which seemed louder with each passing second. She swallowed hard, her thoughts still swirling in confusion. "Why me?" she finally asked, the words rasping in her throat. The man's lips curled into a smile that was both cruel and knowing. He tilted his head slightly as if considering her question, then answered with the same cold calm. "Because you were always meant to be part of this, Jennifer. You just didn't realize it. The ones who try to run are always the ones who get caught." His words were like a bitter truth, one she had spent years avoiding. Her entire life. Was it all just part of some twisted plan? But she couldn't dwell on the thought for long. The darkness, that same consuming presence, seemed to close in around her. A sharp sensation of being watched intensified, and Jennifer's limbs felt heavy, as though the world were slowly sinking beneath her. It was then she realized this wasn't about him. It had never been about him. This was about her. She had been the one weaving the threads of her own undoing, following the breadcrumbs she never knew were there. Jennifer had been both the puppet and the puppeteer, caught in a game of her own making. Her gaze flickered to the ground, where the faintest trace of red blood still stained the earth. It was the blood of her betrayal, the life she had tried to build after everything had crumbled. And now, standing in the midst of it all, she finally understood. She was just another piece in the puzzle, an inevitable outcome of her own decisions. The man's voice broke the stillness again. "You've always known, Jennifer. That's why you never truly escaped." Jennifer closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. For the first time, she didn't resist. There was no fight left in her. Her past had caught up with her. And now, it was time to face it all, to pay the price for everything she had done and failed to do. The man stepped closer, and Jennifer did not flinch. Her story had come full circle, and this was where it ended. The game was over. She had lost, and nothing would ever be the same again. Here's the final ending section of your story. Jennifer's heart raced in her chest as she stared at the man, standing motionless in front of her car. His cold eyes never wavered from hers. She had nowhere to go. The car was her only barrier between her and whatever he had planned. Her fingers gripped the wheel, so tightly her joints began to ache. But then, in the eerie silence that followed, she realized something. The game was over. She couldn't run anymore. The realization hit her like a brick. There would be no escape, not tonight, and not from what they had already planned. Jennifer had always known, deep down, that this moment would come. She just never expected it to happen like this. Slowly, with trembling hands, she reached for the door handle. The man didn't move. He just waited. The world outside her car seemed to grow distant, as though time itself was slowing. Every breath felt too loud in her ears. With one last glance at the stranger's unblinking eyes, Jennifer stepped out of the car. The night air bit at her exposed skin. "I've tried to outrun you," she said, her voice quieter than she expected. "But I can't anymore. What do you want from me?" The man smiled, the same chilling smile she had seen before. "I don't want anything from you, Jennifer. I've gotten what I needed all along. You just haven't realized it yet." Her mind raced, piecing together the pieces of the puzzle she had missed. Her pulse hammered as she understood the truth. She began, but the words stuck. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but the weight of the truth held her back. "You were always part of it," he whispered, his voice strangely gentle. "You were never meant to escape. The game, it was always yours to lose." Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet felt like it was shifting. The world tilted. And before Jennifer could process another thought, the man stepped closer, the distance between them closing with terrifying speed. There would be no final confrontation, no grand escape. The final chapter had been written long ago,